let's go ahead and get started. We'll probably have a few more folks join us as we do our introduction today. So good evening, Fighting Scots. My name is Jordan Sherpy Lencioni. I'm the Associate Director of Alumni Engagement here at Monmouth College. I want to welcome everyone this evening to our first Tartan Talk of the year titled Black Baseball and Black History with Dr. Raymond, class of 91. We're so thrilled that everybody is able to join us this evening. Before we begin, just to cover a few housekeeping items, today's event is live on Facebook and it is also being recorded, so it will be available on the Monmouth College website next week. For the best viewing experience during tonight's event, make sure you are in speaker mode. If you're on Zoom, if you're on Facebook Live, it'll automatically default to that for you. You can find the speaker mode located in the right-hand corner of your screen. Attendees viewing on Zoom will be able to ask questions using the chat feature below. We will answer all the questions at the end of today's presentation. Also, at the end of tonight's event, you'll see a short 3-minute survey pop up. We just ask you to please fill that out, give us some ideas and some feedback on future events and speakers that you'd like to see in events like this. Now, a little bit about our presenter tonight. We have Dr. Raymond Doswell, class of 91, and he's the Vice President of Curatorial Services for the Negro Baseball League's Museum. That's located in Kansas City, Missouri. He was born in St. Louis, Missouri, and grew up in East St. Louis, Illinois. Graduating from Monmouth College with a bachelor's degree in history and training and education, he then taught high school briefly in the St. Louis area before attending graduate school at the University of California, Riverside, and then earned his doctorate in educational leadership from Kansas State University. Dr. Doswell joined the staff of the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum in 1995 as its first curator. The museum has grown into an important national attraction, welcoming close to 60,000 visitors annually. Dr. Doswell travels extensively as a public speaker on topics of baseball and African American history. And now, as the museum's vice president, he manages exhibitions, archives, and educational programs. Raymond, the floor is yours.
Well, good evening, everyone. Good evening, Fighting Scots, and thank you for taking time on your Tuesday evening to come and hear little old me. We're very appreciative. Greetings from Kansas City, Missouri, in my very messy office here in the basement of the Baseball Museum. I'm Ray Doswell, and it's good to know that there's some friends out there as well from my time at Monmouth, and we're glad to have you all here. I'm going to teach you a little bit about baseball and history. I've had an opportunity many years ago to talk about this on campus in the past, but some things have changed and we were able to add some information for you and give you a little bit of history as it relates to Black baseball. I'm just going to narrate some of these slides for you as I go through, but as noted in the introduction, my journey since Monmouth has taken me all over the country to learn about African American history and to get my education. Since Monmouth, I got introduced to an internship at the University of California, which I learned about at the Career Services Center on campus. But fortunately, too, got the opportunity to do that teaching job that summer, after that summer. But got a chance to go out to University of California, Riverside for the summer, and then taught at Webster Groves High School in just outside of St. Louis for about a year. Before getting an opportunity to go back to school in California. I've been working at the museum since 1995. After graduation in California. And then later on, I got an opportunity to work with Kansas State University to work on educational programming there. They were a partner of ours, and that led to me getting a doctorate in education while doing that work. So I've been in Kansas City for 25 years, and just remembering now that this is our 30th class reunion this year, my goodness, from Monmouth College. But the most important thing that I want you all to know about me is that I'm a lifelong St. Louis Cardinals baseball fan. So you can boo and hiss if you're near Chicago if you want to, but the Cardinals rule, the best organization in all of American sports. But lifelong Cardinals fan, having grown up in St. Louis and The 82 Cardinals were very important to me. The great Lou Brock, who we lost last year, is someone who's also very important to me as a baseball fan. But I've loved baseball, but I won't say that I'm a baseball historian in the same way as some others have. There are a lot more smarter people than me that study baseball history, especially from statistics and other aspects. But I hope to meld African American history with the story of baseball, so that it becomes more relevant in discussing other topics as it relates to sociology and anthropology, and of course, what we've been challenged with this past year is understanding race and social justice. And our museum has been called upon to help with those topics by providing content on that history. I'll talk about a little bit of that as I go through my slides tonight, and we'll incorporate some historical photos, and specifically some photos from our historical archives, as well as images of some of our artwork that we have at the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. The museum itself was founded in 1990 here in Kansas City, Missouri, by a group of historians and former baseball players and business people who wanted to to preserve the important history that is here because of the special place that Kansas City in particular holds for this history. But this is a national and international institution. Um, this is our primary exhibition area we call the Field of Legends. This is actually the end of the exhibition. I know a few of you have been here to the museum before. Um, but the idea is that when you walk into the museum, you're walking into a mock baseball stadium. And the idea is that you go around the museum and you learn all the history. We have several hundred photographs, uh, uh, artifacts, and things related to African American baseball history from the late 1800s through the 1960s. And the idea is that you can see this baseball diamond, this field of legends, with these life size bronze statues representing key players in African American baseball history. But you can't get to the field until you've learned all the history. You can see it through a chicken wire fence when you walk in. And that chicken wire is important because it obviously separates you metaphorically from the baseball diamond so you don't get hit with any baseballs. But also chicken wire was something that was used in certain stadiums where there was white and black seating, and it segregated the white and black patrons from the ball field. So it's symbolic in that way. So you learn the history, you endure the history, and then you get the chance to walk out onto the field among the legends of the game. And that is one of the great joys that fans have when they go through the museum. But I want to tell you a quick story about some of the artifacts we have in the museum, and one in particular. As you walk around this field on the backside, almost behind the center field wall, we have a special section there that has some wonderful photos of a particular player. It's one of my favorite pieces in the museum because we're able to blow up this photo that we have. It's a small 4x4 photo that we've blown up to be a little bit bigger. But there's no baseball in the photo. There's no bats, no balls, no gloves, no uniforms. It's a photo of a young man who is squinting from the sun as he's posing for this picture, standing literally on the train tracks at a train station in the South. Has a duffel bag next to him in a working man's clothing, um, looking pensive but confident in the journey ahead of him. Um, the photo shows this young man ready to go. He's about to join a baseball team, and particularly an African American baseball team. We have a copy of a letter that accompanied this photo. And on the letter, it's of two baseball officials for this team talking about the recruitment of this young man. And then there's a line in the letter that says, I do think he will develop into a great player one of these days. I do think he will develop into a great player one of these days. Well, that young man did develop into a great player. He went on from that team, which was the Indianapolis Clowns, and played that summer in the 1950s, and was later recruited from the Clowns, having had a tremendous summer. Uh, to go on to the Braves organization in Major League Baseball and become the all-time home run leader. And as just the lately departed Henry Aaron. You can see there's a photo of him. He's at a press conference in the 90s here at the museum. And you see at the top of that red banner, it says Discover Greatness. That is our motto here at the museum. And when I see that photo, it shows a moment when greatness is discovered. He was 17, 18 years old in that photo. And when he took a tour of the museum, he told our president, Bob Kendrick, when he saw that photograph, that in that duffel bag, he may have had two change of clothes, a ham sandwich, and maybe $2.50 in his pocket going to chase the dream of being a black baseball player. And he is one of many baseball players who's toiled in what we called the Negro leagues. Of course, we don't use the term Negro anymore or colored anymore, although you will see that because these were names of these teams and some of these businesses that were associated with these teams. But they were called the Negro leagues, and it's always Negro leagues plural. I want to emphasize that it's never singular; it's always plural. So, what were the Negro leagues? We define the Negro Leagues here at the museum as a business structure representing the highest level of professional baseball that was available to African American and Afro-Latino athletes during the 19th century through to the mid 20th century. And that's important. The Afro-Latino athletes are extremely important to this story as well, those who are dark-skinned Cuban players, because there were what you might call white Cuban players or other folk from other countries, but black Cubans or from Puerto Rico or even Mexico, if you wanted to play baseball in the United States and you could immigrate to the United States and play baseball, you had to play in the Negro Leagues if you were darker skinned. The Negro Leagues existed because of racism and segregation in America. And again, the primary time period we talk about is 1860 to 1960, but more on that later. But the role of African Americans and Latino athletes in baseball are studied in that 100 years of history. And I'd be remiss, we've got a great photo here of Earl Mickey Taborn, who's from Cary Mills, Illinois, down by Carbondale area, who would go on and be one of these players who not only played in the Negro Leagues, played briefly in the minor leagues in the New York, New Jersey area, but spent most of his career actually playing in Mexico and in the Caribbean, where he spent a lot of years there and had great success in baseball. So here's the beginning of our museum. When you come, this is meant to look like an old baseball stadium. We're going to show you some pictures and weave in the history as we go through. You buy your ticket and you walk inside, you go through the turnstiles, and then you come upon this chart. And this chart shows you the names of the different leagues and some of the different teams that were part of African American baseball. There were more leagues that existed, but on this chart, we list 6 different leagues, and they represent close to 30 different cities and over 70 different teams, not all existing at the same time, but through various periods between the main part of the history, 1920 to 1960. More on that shortly. But the primary story of the Negro Leagues is that this is really a story steeped in our understanding of the Great Migration, the Great Migration period for African Americans, when African Americans between World War One, or maybe even really you can go back to Reconstruction after the Civil War, but in a big period between right after World War One up through the 1930s and 40s, when African Americans are moving from the South to the Midwest and to the Northeast in particular, and eventually out West. Also moving from rural areas to urban areas, escaping racism and Jim Crow in the South, but also looking for jobs and opportunities in these urban enclaves that were coming up across the country. Kansas City being one of those, Chicago being one of the main places where folks would travel to come looking for jobs, looking for opportunities. New York City, of course, is another. And so these are some of the cities um, that had major Negro League teams. This isn't a complete list of cities, but a number of the major urban centers. And of course, folks are building enclaves for culture and jazz music and black churches and the schools and everything happening in many of these communities. And baseball became among the businesses and social activities that was part of the Great Migration. If we look back 100 years or so in the Negro Leagues and looking back 100 years ago, we can see obviously things that were, let me go back ahead to things that were happening in the country. Of course, there was giant influenza pandemic that was happening between 1918 and 1920, the so-called Spanish flu. Um, During this period, although it was much more extended, the so-called Red Summer of 1919, where there was tremendous amount of pushback against African Americans moving into these places in the urban centers looking for jobs. But of course, after the war, African American soldiers were coming back looking for certain rights after having fought for freedom in Europe in many places. During the migration in this period, especially in 1919, there's over 500,000 African Americans moving across the country. And there were explosive race riots beginning in 1917 in places like Houston and my hometown of East St. Louis, and of course, Chicago. All this sound a little familiar? Pandemic, race riots, we're kind of still dealing with the same issues 100 years later. Um, but the race riots, especially, were something that African Americans really responded to, obviously, because their lives were being threatened. But one among the responses was the so-called New Negro movement and the Harlem Renaissance. It included the explosion of art and culture that was happening primarily in Harlem, New York, but in many urban centers that included jazz, that included literature, that included fine art. The one photo there on the left is one of the UNIA parades that were held in New York or Chicago by Marcus Garvey, which was the Back to Africa movement. I love the sign there that says, "The new Negro has no fear." This was a response to what was happening, the brutality that they were feeling. They responded with fighting for rights and ensuring their racial pride. But it's in this mix too of history that's happening, of which the Negro Leagues begins to bubble up as well, the creation of the Negro Leagues. There were African American baseball teams going back, or at least African American participation in baseball, going back to the beginnings of the game and the various ball and stick games that would ultimately develop into baseball and professional baseball. And there were teams and individuals who did play in the 1800s. In fact, there were African Americans who played on what you might call major league teams in the late 1800s. But by 1900, those players were pushed out. There was never a written rule that said that blacks could not play Major League Baseball. It was collusion among the owners and some of the players. Simply put, what they called a gentleman's agreement, so-called gentleman's agreement, not to sign new African American baseball players. So these were businessmen, these black players and black team owners and enthusiasts. They started their own teams, or at least they tried to, and they tried to start their own leagues. What having leagues meant was obviously teams playing each other, common opponents on a regular schedule, brought financial stability, and brought a level of professionalism. And in turn, they would get noticed maybe more by the white leagues as well as being professional teams, as opposed to just playing exhibition games across the country against white or black teams. Um, it wasn't until 1920, though, that we see the first successful remnants of coalescing of teams to create what will become a stable league. And this section of the museum demonstrates and shows some of the early places in which these early teams were beginning to emerge, like Indianapolis and Detroit and St. Louis. And it's here where the Negro Leagues began to form in 1920. You see that statue there in the middle. That is Andrew Foster, better known as Rube Foster, born in Calvert, Texas, an outstanding baseball player in his own right. Um, but eventually became a baseball team leader, having played in Cuba, played in Philadelphia, started his career in Chicago, and then began to lead teams in Chicago as early as 1910. Um, Ultimately, founding a team called the Chicago American Giants, of which would be a charter member of what would become the Negro National League. He had a lot of power and a lot of influence among different baseball teams and players, and he had a lot of influence and connections with white baseball teams to be able to use stadiums. In Chicago, he was able to use Shoreline Park, which was owned by the White Sox, Chicago White Sox, and eventually there became use of Old Comiskey Park as well. You either loved or hated Foster, but everyone respected him. He was that dynamic figure in baseball history. Some would call him the father of black baseball. Through his leadership and among other people, they got together at a meeting to be held in Kansas City, Missouri in February of 1920, mid February of 1920, actually February 13th, 1920. The column there from the Chicago Defender, the black newspaper in Chicago, uh, chronicles the events of that meeting, and that became the meeting for the creation of the Negro National League. That meeting was held here in Kansas City at the Paseo YMCA building, which still stands around the corner from our location here in Kansas City. It was called the Colored YMCA because the black community built this YMCA through a challenge grant. You may have heard of Julius Rosenwald from Chicago area, who was part of the Sears and Roebuck family, and he gave a lot of challenge grants to rural black schools, mostly in the South, to build schools. If the community would come up with part of the money, he would give them the rest. And there's all these Rosenwald schools across the South. That included a couple of YMCA buildings, and this was one. He gave a challenge grant to the YMCA, and the black community raised the money to do this. This was in 1914 for the building itself, but it became the primary meeting place for a lot of groups in Kansas City, and the baseball team owners met here to hammer out the rules and the constitution for the Negro National League. And rival leagues would form after that. We marked the occasion of that February 13th, 1920 last year with the what we call the Negro League Centennial. So we did as much celebrating as we could in early February. Of course, the pandemic shut us down before we can do a lot more. But the impact of the anniversary was still felt across the country in many ways through celebrations in many different communities and ballparks across the country. So when we start playing baseball and the black teams, we saw some of the places where they played, and it included some important team names and team players like the Kansas City Monarchs or the St. Louis Stars, and the Chicago American Giants, who I mentioned before. That first year, there were 8 teams as part of the Negro National League. Soon, rival leagues formed in the East and was called the Eastern Colored League, and these were teams in and around the Philadelphia area, Washington, D.C., and New York City area. And then they began to play each other in interleague play, and they would fight for players as well. Players would jump team contracts and things like that. There were lots of disputes among the leagues, but they were able to work those differences out and have a Negro Leagues World Series in 1924, and began interleague play, and that lasted through to the Great Depression. Um, During the Great Depression, both the Eastern Colored League and the Negro National League had folded, but a few individual teams kept going through the 1930s before they reformed. Among the innovations of some of those teams was night baseball. Here in the exhibit, we have a wall dedicated to night baseball, which the great Kansas City Monarchs develop a portable lighting system. You can see the truck and the poles there. But this was 1935 and 1930, excuse me, and they were playing night baseball games, traveling across the country 5 years before the first official night baseball game in Major League Baseball, which was in Cincinnati in 1935. So this was one innovation brought to you by the Kansas City Monarchs, who were led by J.L. Wilkinson, who was one of the few white men who were involved in early ownership in the Negro Leagues. Very well respected man from Algona, Iowa, who helped create some independent baseball teams of his own and develop the lighting system. Teams traveled across the country as best they could by train when they could. Of course, those train conditions were segregated in the early years, but once bus travel and roads improved, the teams that could master bus travel could get more games and had to depend on the train schedules, and could get not only games between their league opponents, but could get games in between league opponents to make additional money. For example, the Kansas City team would go and drive down to St. Louis to play the St. Louis League team, but on along the way, they could stop at Jefferson City, they could stop outside in St. Charles, Missouri, and maybe play a white team or even a black team that wasn't part of the league but could earn extra money, and then maybe from St. Louis go up to Chicago. in the early versions of Interstate 55 and play in Peoria and play in Joliet, Illinois, and just pick up extra games and play in and around, maybe go over to Gary, Indiana, and play additional games. But you had to master this travel. And if you did, then you became a very successful team. Um, you could outlast a number of teams, and you could just have enough money to recruit players and maybe occasionally even find a diamond in the rough among your opponents while you're out there. Maybe bring a young man along as you went and go on to the next city and things like that. Teams that didn't master that didn't last very long, and the games kind of ebbed and flowed for a lot of these teams. Success was not always easy. Um, Traveling in segregated conditions, having to stay at segregated hotels, having to shop at segregated grocery stores and restaurants. But over time, uh, these teams, especially if they went to white areas, were invited to come and play these teams, and they had to make sure that they were going to be well treated because people appreciated their entertainment, and so that kind of broke down some of the barriers that they had to endure. Now, the leagues folded briefly around the Great Depression, reformed around 1933. Andrew Foster dies in 1930. So there was some uncertainty there, but there were a number of independent teams like the Kansas City Monarchs and their Lights that were able to survive the Depression until the leagues reformed in and around 1933. This era of league history, as I have in the exhibit, is called the Golden Years, where you start to see a rebirth of the Negro Leagues and a rebirth of many teams, especially those in the East Coast. One of the key players in this time was Gus Greenlee. Gus Greenlee was from South Carolina and was a World War I veteran and settled in Pittsburgh. And the best way to describe Mr. Greenlee is that he was a benevolent gangster. He was the numbers runner in Pittsburgh. He owned a restaurant called the Crawford Grill. He had other legitimate industries as well, but he managed to create a great baseball team. The Pittsburgh Crawfords, and had a bus, and also had his own ballpark. So you didn't have to rent a ballpark from the Pittsburgh Pirates or any minor league team where there was restrictions on facilities uses and things like that. He got his own ball field, which was modest, but it was suitable and it was their own. And that was another thing that a lot of teams didn't get a chance to enjoy. Few teams had their own baseball stadiums during this time period. Um, but he was able to successfully do that and had some of the greatest players because he had money to recruit and even steal some players from other teams for his mid 30s team, the Pittsburgh Crawfords, including the great Josh Gibson, Cool Papa Bell, and Leroy Satchel Paige. Another one of his ideas was to create an all-star game in 1933. Major League Baseball had started their All Star game in 1933, and he was able to also create a fan vote All Star game too, uh, but it was being held every year in Chicago. Now, these are pictures from different stadiums. This is in Kansas City, where there were lots of crowds that would come out. And for the All Star games, many of these crowds were just as large. Imagine being in Chicago at Old Comiskey Park. Um, Over 50,000 fans could pack that ballpark. It was called the East West Classic during that time. And the first game had certainly well over 40,000 fans. The ballpark's on the south side of Chicago. That's an all black neighborhood, mostly black neighborhood. Fans could go there, be part of the ballpark, even though they rented it from the Chicago White Sox. There were restaurants and barbershops and all kinds of things and hotels especially, that could support the tourists that were coming in to come watch this game. So this was really maybe even more important than the year-end championship games to be able to, as a player, to be voted on the team and for fans to go to Chicago to be able to attend the game. I mentioned the barbershops and other businesses. These were important to the Black community. This is one of the exhibits we have. We have a mock hotel room and a mock barbershop there, which is where my old boss used to say you could go get your BS degree, if you will. Listen to the fellas talking about sports or whatever news, and certainly trying to solve the world's problems in the barbershop. Um, but we have a wonderful display with these wax figures, kind of give you a sense of what life was like in the times back then. This little section also shows some images of the 18th Divine area, and these old turnstiles are from the old municipal stadium that was here in Kansas City, where the Kansas City Monarchs played, and ultimately became the home of the Kansas City Athletics, who moved from Philadelphia, and now they're the Oakland Athletics. Um, but it was a great atmosphere and a family atmosphere by all accounts. And in particular here in Kansas City, the Monarchs were among the best and longest lasting teams in that history. So through that time, 1920 to 1960, you see some great players in other teams. I mentioned some of them already, but there's the Cleveland Buckeyes, and before that, the St. Paul Colored Gophers, among other teams. And through wars and through economic strife, but through everything that was happening to the Black community, all these teams, as I said, really over 70 teams all across the Midwest, mostly the Northeast and in the Southeast, were divided into these really about 8 leagues during that time, bringing thrills and excitement and revenue to many different communities. They really proved themselves as great talents, and you had to love the game to endure some of the indignities that they would have to endure. But at the same time, to a man, and I've had a chance to interview a lot of them, they all would not have regretted the moments of being part of all black baseball. They really enjoyed it. But clearly, they were helping to break down the doors of segregation in America. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit to World War II, especially during the war. Black soldiers are fighting valiantly against fascism and Nazism in Europe. But back home, African Americans are really experiencing the same things without equal rights. And this isn't lost, especially in terms of sports, because African American and Afro Latino players are not allowed to play Major League Baseball. It's not lost on members of the Black press, but it's something that they pushed and others pushed in other ways. The left press, and particularly the Daily Worker in New York, the communist newspaper, pushed it as a labor issue. It became part of progressive politics in New York City, in particular, as a labor issue, which Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia and others in city council and the state really pushed this issue of where they could push the pins of baseball to and the levers of baseball to get them to think about this as a labor issue. For example, the city council had control of Sunday baseball. And if teams like the Brooklyn Dodgers and the New York Giants wanted to play Sunday baseball, then they need to think about opening up their labor to keep it from being segregated. This is the Negro Baseball Yearbook, which was an annual publication for a few years that went over kind of the year-end statistics and other records related to baseball. That's Ernest Spoon Carter there as a baseball player. Um, Perhaps a quick example of the push that was happening not only among the media and among politicians, but even among baseball fans was the situation in Washington, D.C. In Washington, another large ballpark, Griffith Stadium, is in Northeast Washington in a black neighborhood as well. It was home of the Washington Senators white baseball team. Uh, Griffith Stadium is currently now where Howard University, all black college, Howard University Hospital is on those grounds. So on Sundays, you could go watch the black team, the Homestead Grays, who had moved from Pittsburgh to Washington to take advantage of this growing black population in DC who had a lot of great middle class jobs, some of them working for the government, a lot of disposable income, can go to baseball games. And of course, um, with the war going on, there was a lot more factory jobs and other things that were available to many people. But as a fan, even a white fan, you could go to Griffith Stadium on Sunday and watch the Grays. And the Grays are in this stretch in the 40s of winning 9 straight Negro League pennants and championships. You can go back on Tuesday and watch the Washington Senators and maybe see the worst team in baseball history. The saying back then was Washington for, as they were referring to the Senators, Washington, first in war, first in peace, last in the American League East. So you're a white fan and you go to both games and you say, well, I was here on Sunday and they had these players who could really improve our team. Why can't we have them? It's just because of the color of their skin. Well, this doesn't make sense. All these things begin to kind of coalesce together um, in this time. This is when we meet a young man in 1940s named Jack Roosevelt Robinson, or better known as Jackie. Jackie's family was born in Cairo, Georgia, where they were sharecroppers. They escaped sharecropping and their extended family to take the train and ultimately end up in Pasadena, California, where he grew up on Pepper Street. Um, and he got into a little trouble. He had a little interracial gang of kids from all different races, but all were poor like him, who would run around Pepper Street and cause lots of problems, or people would cause problems for them. But he grew up in a loving family with his mother and a large extended family. His brother Mac was a great athlete in college, went to college, was an Olympian, was on the Olympic team with Jesse Owens in the 36 Olympics in Germany. But Jackie would come along and break all his collegiate and AAU track and field records. He was an expert broad jumper, among other things. In the middle photo at the top there he is, number 28, playing football, where he played defense and punt returner. That's Willie Strode and Kenny Washington flanking him, who become two of the first African Americans to play in the National Football League. He played semi-professional basketball, and he also played baseball in junior college at Pasadena Junior College and for the UCLA Bruins. After he left junior college, he went 2 years. Well, didn't quite finish at UCLA, but he lettered in four sports at UCLA. He could also play tennis very well. He was just an outstanding athlete. The only thing he could not do was swim. And that's another story for another time. But outstanding, important athlete. Um, he gets drafted to the United States Army and ends up being stationed near here in Kansas City at Fort Riley, Kansas, the Big Red One, the First Infantry. Um, but he was part of the he became part of the cavalry units that were here. He went to officers training school here. Um, which was quite a fight as well, but he got support from another famous athlete, Joe Louis, who actually ended up being stationed in Fort Riley too, and helped him and other black soldiers get into officers training school. After Fort Riley, he was sent down to Texas. So technically, as an infantryman, he became part of the cavalry. The famed Buffalo Soldiers organizations claim him as a Buffalo Soldier since he was part of the cavalry. But he was transferred down to Texas to Fort Hood, where he actually helped to train tank battalion to go into the European theater. But football and sports injuries to his ankle would prevent him from going overseas. Um, during the time in Texas, he was court-martialed for not moving to the back of a bus and getting in an altercation with the bus driver and the local military police on the base. They made a whole movie about that incident, but he beat that accusation, but was discharged from the army and needed a job. So the army and the military and the war had depleted a lot of baseball teams, including the white baseball teams, but as well as the black baseball teams, but less so for the Negro leagues. So that actually opened up an opportunity for him to play baseball. And the Kansas City Monarchs needed an infielder, and so he joined the Kansas City Monarchs for the 1945 season. There he is with the legendary Leroy Satchel Paige, his teammate and pitcher there. He had a pretty decent year at shortstop, and at the same time, the political pressures and other things were pushing teams like the Brooklyn Dodgers to make a decision about recruiting black players. And General Manager Branch Rickey always had in the back of his mind to try to get a black player to the major leagues. It's something that I think that he was general manager of St. Louis Cardinals and may have had that formulated even a little bit early around that time. But once he got to Brooklyn and became general manager, he started steadily planning for this opportunity and ultimately recruited Robinson to be that player in the fall of 1945, signing a minor league contract in 1946 with Montreal, and then joining the Brooklyn Dodgers on April 15th, 1947, a day that is now known as Jackie Robinson Day across the baseball world. That opened the door for other players as well. This is Hank Thompson, who played for the Kansas City Monarchs and ultimately played with the St. Louis Browns. He and Willard Brown joined the St. Louis Browns on the same day in July of 1947. Um, there were 5 players total who integrated baseball in 1947. So Thompson and Brown, Larry Doby actually was before them with the Cleveland Indians in early July, and Thompson and Brown later in July joined the St. Louis Browns, and then Dan Bankhead, a pitcher, would later join Jackie Robinson in September. So 5 players helped integrate baseball during that time. Now, Hank Thompson would get traded to the New York Giants and be among the first players there as well. And they would go on to win a World Series with the New York Giants. He also had a young teammate to come up a little bit later named Willie Mays that helped that situation pretty well. It opened the door for other Afro Latino players like Orestes Minoso, who is known as Minnie, and as Ernie Banks was Mr. Cub, he was Mr. White Sox. But he started with the Cleveland Indians before being traded to the Chicago White Sox in the American League. And even before that, he was with the New York Cubans, among other Negro League teams, had a long career in black baseball, as well as Cuban and Mexican leagues as well. Really one of the most outstanding players in baseball history, Minnie Minoso. It also opened the door for many coaches and scouts. But Chicago's all over this thing because this is the great John Buck O'Neill, former Kansas City Monarch, um, who became the first African American coach in Major League Baseball in 1962. He was an outstanding first baseman in his own right and helped recruit players to the Negro Leagues like Ernie Banks. And then later on with the Cubs, players like Lou Brock and Billy Williams, he helped nurture and mentor them. Um, Buck was able to travel the South uh, uh, in places like black colleges, and that's where he found a player like Lou Brock, who's at Southern University. And he had the talent to be able to do that and was a mentor for many years to many black players. We have a section in the museum, a newly renovated section called the Barrier Breakers, and that talks about this integration period. You note there on the title there, it says from Jackie to Pumpsy, 1947 and 1959. Pumpsy Green, who was the last player to integrate, the last major league team with the Boston Red Sox in 1959. That's how long it took for all the main 16 teams at that time in Major League Baseball to have at least one black or Afro Latino player on their roster. Uh, all those years, about 120 players total that we recognize as barrier breakers. And this is a section that we just opened in the museum in June that we just renovated that highlights in particular those players who were the first to integrate their teams. That is Maury Wills, although he's a little bit younger. Maury Wills, Los Angeles Dodgers jersey there that we're very proud to showcase inside the museum. The integration of baseball, of course, ultimately meant that the great Negro League teams had to shift to become somewhat pseudo minor league teams. They began to feed the major leagues with black players, and then ultimately black players were able to bypass the Negro leagues altogether, and the Negro leagues began to lose fans. Among the things that they tried was to keep fans coming was to actually have women play with the men in the Negro Leagues. And this is a new section too at the museum that highlights the connection of women to Negro League baseball. In particular, the 3 players. As Tony Stone in the middle there, Connie Morgan and Mamie Peanut Johnson, who played with the Indianapolis Clowns in the 1950s. They were very good athletes, and but it was an attempt to get fans to come out to games. But ultimately, by 1959, 1960, this effort and many others were not enough to really sustain the Negro Leagues. Black fans wanted to see their favorite players on the all-white teams. And by 1960, with a few straggling exceptions, the Negro Leagues had pretty much ended its tour. And even though the integration of baseball was important for creating a just society, it ultimately did end the Negro Leagues, and with many of these teams fading out of the history by about 1960. But if we look at the record books, we see some amazing results. We see the dramatic impact that Black players have on baseball history. For example, this is just one example. This slide shows you uh, the award winners for Rookie of the Year, Most Valuable Player Award between 1947 and 1960. All of these are Black or Latino players. The Rookie of the Year award is now named the Jackie Robinson Memorial Award, and the MVP award, Most Valuable Player Award, is ironically named Kennesaw Mountain Landis Memorial Award. Judge Landis was the commissioner of baseball during segregation, um, and was not an advocate of integration, although he would say that he had no opinion on it one way or the other, but he wasn't very helpful either. There's a movement now to remove his name from this award. But ironically, in this period of integration, these are all Black and Latino players who dominated the awards. Most of those players are in the National League, and the National League dominated the All-Star game for years and years, almost 20 games in a row, because they had the biggest influx of talent. And although there were some key American League teams who did get Black players, like the Cleveland Indians, they got Satchel Paige and Larry Doby, and they won the World Series in the 40s. They were probably the exception to that rule. And as I noted earlier, the Boston Red Sox were one of the last teams to integrate in 1959. Many of these players are now honored by the National Baseball Hall of Fame, and we have a section in our museum, these lockers, these mock lockers, with copies of the placards that hang in Cooperstown, New York, honoring these players, managers, and owners who are part of the Negro Leagues. And they include there are well over 40 players, and they include Henry Aaron, who we mentioned, Raleigh Bismacki. The third photo at the top, that's a very young Ernie Banks with the Kansas City Monarchs. Our lockers primarily feature those players who were highlighted from the Negro Leagues who made it to the Hall of Fame. So there's not a locker for Banks or Aaron, but there is one for William Judy Johnson, who's there at the top. Right, and Willard Brown, who's there at the top, on the bottom there. So as I said, over 40 players and managers and owners who are honored for their roles in the Negro Leagues, honored by the National Baseball Hall of Fame. What's one important point about that for us? We're not a Hall of Fame. We're not the Negro Leagues Hall of Fame. We're not a Black Baseball Hall of Fame. We don't want a segregated Hall of Fame. The National Baseball Hall of Fame honors these players, and we want to continue to encourage them to do so. We're a museum, and we try to tell every story we can as space allows, from the bat boy to the home run hitter. Very important philosophical point that's important to us. And we try to showcase as much of that history as possible. This is a uniform wall that has, you see the very vibrant colors that the Negro League teams used back then. These are exciting uniforms. Of course, you can buy replicas of some of these as well if you want to showcase the history. Noting again that there's some close-ups of some of the statues we have. This is of Martin de Higo, who is the batter on our Field of Legends. He is from Cuba, and he's honored by many Latino baseball halls of fame, including in Venezuela and Cuba and Puerto Rico as well. Just an outstanding pitcher and an all-around hitter as well. We recently added a statue for the umpire as well. This is Bob Motley, who umpired in the 50s. For years, we didn't have an umpire in the field, but we put these together. This one is made by artist Quan Wu from the University of Kansas. He actually, on the other statues, he did the bust or the faces, but this one, he did the whole thing. He's an outstanding national artist. He's done a number of monuments across the country as well. And of course, you're welcome after you've gone through the tour to come back to the Field of Legends, where all the statues of all the key players, many of these players are inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame, with the exception of Mr. Motley. And now you exit out through the gift shop, and you can buy as many caps and T-shirts as you like, and books, of course, to showcase the history. So I'm ready to close here, and I'm sure you may have questions in the chat. We're happy to answer them for you. This bat is a piece of our art exhibit done by artist Rob Hatem. where he asked the question, what would it have been like if the Negro Leagues had not been segregated, and what would the record books look like had there been equality in baseball? And I take a little credit for this piece because I helped him figure out how to get it all together. So, but it's just one of my favorite pieces in our art exhibit. But before I close the questions, I'll keep the slide up for just a second. I hadn't talked about the Negro League statistics news that maybe some of you may have heard about nationally, and I'm happy to share that from the chat questions or anything. But if you are interested in learning about what the actual statistics are, this site seamheads.com is primarily where those statistics will rest that are being discussed. Excuse me. But you can also, some of that from research done by the National Baseball Hall of Fame is on this other site that you baseball fans may know is baseballreference.com, where there's baseball statistics from every league, minor league, major league, and now some Negro leagues are there. But the seam heads is where is kind of the crux of this recent news. There is a site here from the National Baseball Hall of Fame that just shows the Negro League players who are elected there. And retrosheet.org is just statistics, box scores of baseball in general. They're about to add more Negro Leagues material. I think they actually have some pre-Negro League material already up, but there's great material there if you're interested in learning about it. There's one more slide I want to show you, and if you didn't get those, I'm happy to share any of these sites with you. This has just information about the museum if you want to learn more. Our website, especially if you want to shop, you can shop at nlbm.com. We have videos on our YouTube channel. The e-museum for teachers is up, and it has video clips and oral histories of certain players. I will just tell you that hopefully by the end of the year, that's going to be completely revamped, but there's still some good stuff there, even some old lesson plans if you want to use those. We're on Facebook, and those are 2 Twitter accounts, our museum account, and for our president, Bob Kendrick, who often tweets on behalf of the museum as well. So I've talked enough, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Doswell. So we have a lot of questions that came through and a couple of comments. So I'll start with the comments. Several people said that this museum is a national treasure. Many have been multiple times, and they highly encourage everyone to come see it. One of your classmates, Juan Mitchell, says, "Nice to see you after all these years."
Hello, Juan.
And then this is a question that we got multiple times. What are your thoughts on Major League Baseball officially recognizing the Negro Leagues as a major league this year?
Okay, so let me I'll try to quickly explain what it is and then give you my thoughts. So, all right, there are several different leagues that would have been designated Negro leagues. Not every black team was part of the Negro leagues. As I noted earlier, we talk about the highest level that was available to black and Latino athletes. So what Major League Baseball has done, they were asked by the media, why weren't the Negro leagues elevated to major league status? I'll be frank, I had no clue. This wasn't even on my radar, because we always thought of them as major leagues. It wasn't a question, but apparently there are official designations. The fact that they weren't designated goes back to the 1960s, when they were doing these designations, and the Negro leagues were ignored, frankly, which was a gross oversight. So this summer, and there have been historians like the guys at Seamheads who've been working years and years at trying to piece together statistics. Now, even in the 60s, we never had a complete record of the Negro Leagues, and there will never be a 100% complete record of statistics of Negro Leagues because these teams were covered by weekly newspapers. They were not covered by the New York Times or major newspapers on a daily basis. So we don't have a full statistical record. We don't have a lot of surviving box scores. We don't have a lot of surviving scorebooks. So even back in the 60s, even when we were closer to it, they never had a complete record. And it's even worse now. But clearly, noted all the Hall of Fame players and others, clearly they had great talent. And for them not to have been elevated to major league status is, as I noted, a gross oversight. So when reporters started snooping around on this issue, asking some of those historians, and the Baseball Museum really isn't involved in any of this at all. We're consumers of this information as much as anyone else. But they asked Major League Baseball, and Major League Baseball has been a big supporter of the museum. They were supporters of our 100th anniversary celebration, and I think that opened their eyes a little bit to what was going on as well. And they decided in December, yeah, we'll do this. And which initially, honestly, my first thought was meh, but the phone started ringing off the hook. People are just extremely excited about this, and it still continues to ring. What they've decided to do is take of those leagues, and there are about 8 that we kind of recognize, but they've taken 7 of those 8 and they've designated them major leagues from the years 1920 to 1948. All right. Now, I noted that we try to chronicle the history from 1920 to 1960, is what we say, but they go from 1920 to 1948, and those 7 leagues, or teams involved in those leagues, were could be considered major. All right. So it was an oversight. It was great that they corrected the wrong. Many families are excited about it. The ball players themselves felt they didn't need any validation for this. But Major League Baseball has done that. And as I noted, the communities are very excited about it. There are some who are very concerned about it because they feel that it could ultimately lead to watering down the history. They're still trying to work out how the stats will work and meld together. Again, we don't have complete records. So this is going to take some time. This isn't an automatic thing of how this is going to be discussed. Um, and they're only looking at league games. So you might look at the stories of a great Josh Gibson baseball player who maybe some of you have heard of, is credited with have hit 800 home runs in his lifetime career. But if you just take his league games, not the games he played in Latin America or against white teams or amateur teams, it goes down to maybe 2 to 300, which is still a lot, but then maybe he doesn't seem so great. And there are some who are very concerned about it over time. If they're melded together, then people say, well, what was so great about the Negro Leagues if we don't have the rights if they don't really measure up to the greatest of all time? So people are concerned about it being watered down. Howard Bryant, great journalist, said in a program last night that I was with him, said because he thinks that Major League Baseball needs to wear that shame of what they did to the Negro Leagues. And so mixing the stats is a way of getting out of that, in his opinion. Um, and they should wear the shame of what they did by segregating the Negro Leagues. Um, I'm less punitive, but I do understand everyone's concern. So it's important for us here at the museum to continue to contextualize the history and educate people about what's happened.
Great, thank you. Can you share your thoughts on Buck Owens scouting Ernie Banks and the impact that it had for coaching and players?
Buck O'Neill, not Owen. So we want to make sure we get the right name there. Well, Buck O'Neill was a great mentor to Ernie Banks. Really helped nurture him. Ernie Banks was a shy young man from Dallas, Texas, who wanted to avoid conflict. Was very concerned about being in segregated environments, but he had the talent to play, and people like Buck O'Neill, among others, and Cool Papa Bell in particular, really helped nurture him to want to be a professional and taught him how to be a professional. And when he became a coach with the Cubs in '62, helping him make the transition to first base, it was very important for him to keep Ernie in Chicago and keep him satisfied as a star player. He was underappreciated star in Chicago. But he mentored people like Lou Brock and he mentored people like Billy Williams. And just having that linkage to the Negro Leagues and just that wealth of talent that was untapped for many years in Major League Baseball to be able to go over and help recruit those players was important. Buck became a scout for the Cubs and helped also sign players like um, Joe Carter to major league contracts. Uh, and that's something else that he was very proud of as well.
Fantastic, thank you. What is your opinion of the 1976 film The Bingo Long Traveling All Stars and Motor Kings?
Okay, I have a whole nother lecture on that, so you'll have to invite me back for that. All right, but a short answer is that It's everything and nothing, in that it's one of the most important films for baseball history, but it certainly has its flaws and its critiques. I will say this: it's the only film to ever be produced in theaters on Negro Leagues baseball. And that's like 45 years ago, roughly almost 50 years now since that film came out. It came out in the summer of 1976 up against Rocky and the Bad News Bears that summer. Um, it was taken from a book by William Brashler, and there in 1973, Brashler had done interviews with former players to kind of form this fictionalized account of this team that he did, and then the movie gets transformed into the book was much more serious. The movie gets transformed into a comedy, uh, but the movie's important culturally at the time too because it was one of the first films done by Motown, and Motown got into the film business in the 70s. Ultimately, Bingo Long was the second film that they had produced after Lady Sings the Blues, introducing Billy D. Williams and Diana Ross. Uh, Bingo Long, then The Wiz and Mahogany, all important cultural films in Black history. Um, Bingo Long was directed by John Badham, who I think teaches film out in California now, but his later films were a little more important. That included Saturday Night Fever. But he wasn't their first choice. The first choice was a young an up and coming filmmaker, but he decided to do his own projects like Jaws and Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and that was Steven Spielberg. But Badham ended up being the fallback on that film, and um, you had Billy D. Williams. The Bingo Long character in the film was actually a catcher. In the book, was a catcher. You're not gonna put Billy D. Williams in a catcher's mask because he's too handsome. Um, so James Earl Jones gets that role. They switch that, and then you add Richard Pryor, the great Richard Pryor, and so now it becomes a comedy film as well. So they changed it quite a bit. So Negro League players, when they first saw it, recoiled at it because it included some of the clowning players as well, which there were those players and teams, but they didn't feel that that represented the Negro Leagues to them. That was only part of the Negro League. So it's an important film. I gave you my lecture in a nutshell, but I can give you more details if you have me back, and I could do just the Bingo Long film. But it's important. It's an important film, but it is not. It's not documentary. It's meant to be fictional.
Fantastic. And our director of alumni engagement, Jen, says you don't have to ask us twice. We're definitely inviting you back for another
Okay, okay. I
event.
appreciate that. I got other stuff I could talk about too.
Perfect. So you mentioned the women who were involved with the Negro Leagues. Were there any Black women in the All American Girls Professional Baseball League?
From what I know, no, there were not any Black or Latino women in the All American Girls Baseball Professional Leagues, except that there was an All Cuban team in the leagues, and they were from Cuba, and they played in the preseason in one season, traveling together. And so let me back up. Some of those, one or two of those players from that exhibition team that traveled and played in the girls' circuit just for preseason ended up, a couple of them did go and play in the leagues. Um, but there was no African American women, and generally speaking, no Latino women, except for those exceptions. So, one of the stories about one of the female Black players, Mamie Johnson, and she says that she had to try a tryout for some of those leagues, and she was rejected. Um, I'll be honest, I'm not sure her timeline links up well with the women's leagues and that, but it would not surprise me. They just um, uh, that was part of the war effort to get the women to play and to kind of keep baseball going. And there wasn't really much interest in integration of any league at that time, not until after the middle 1940s.
Awesome, thank you. Regarding the Topeka Giants, who might I contact at the museum for more information?
The Topeka Giants is a team that we don't really recognize very much, but I have heard of them. So I have zero information on the Topeka Giants. However, there is an independent historian named Phil Dixon who does live in Kansas City, and he's on Facebook. Um, and he's pretty easy to find that way. He has studied the Topeka Giants, I believe, and regional baseball. And I know that he's also studied some other connections to Topeka and baseball. There's a boxer from the region too that was part of baseball. So I would start with him, and he may know. So you can find him on Facebook. That's Phil S. Dixon, Dixon.
Perfect, thank you. I've got three more questions.
Sure.
Does any of your museum collection travel to other museums or civic locations to educate folks outside of Kansas City about the Negro Leagues?
So actual physical artifact collections, no, but we do have several traveling exhibitions that people can rent to have in their communities. There are actually 4 or 5 traveling exhibits of note. Some of the artwork that you saw, the painting by Kadir Nelson and the question mark bat by Rob Hatem, are part of a art exhibit called Shades of Greatness that travels extensively. Um, it is it was in Springfield, Illinois. I'm sorry, Belleville, Illinois. That's the closest I can think of to Monmouth recently. But So there's about 35 pieces of art that are part of that exhibit, and communities can rent that. We have a photo exhibit called Discover Greatness, which is more of a general history of the Negro Leagues that travels. And actually, in Springfield, hopefully this fall, in September, they will have a new exhibit that we call Negro Leagues Baseball, which is the Latinos spelling of baseball. That's been postponed 3 times due to COVID, but we're looking at September for that, and that'll be in Springfield, Illinois, at the African American Museum there. So those are 3 of the displays that we have that's available for travel. And occasionally there might be some smaller displays. Um, and when it's safe to do so, sometimes I get to travel with some of those and do presentations live.
Great. Are your lectures available on YouTube?
So I haven't done a lot of virtual lectures, honestly. So at least none that I can think of my particular lectures are. There is a lecture that I did for C-SPAN on Jackie Robinson um, that is available. Um, um, I will admit I muffed a question from someone in the audience, and I'm going to try to atone for that in that lecture. But C-SPAN caught it. Now it's there for forever in the National Archives or wherever they put those videos. But um, so that's available. You will probably see a few more of at least my lectures through YouTube. We do have a YouTube channel as well as through other sources of people where they've invited me. Most of our programs, though, here at the museum, I'm moderating usually discussions. We're going to have one this Saturday on Oscar Charleston, great player, and we'll have that on our Facebook page and YouTube, and I think LinkedIn as well this weekend on Saturday at 11 a.m. Central Time. So you can see some of that as well.
Awesome. And then our last question for this evening, would a series between the 1931 Homestead Grays and the 1927 New York Yankees have been the greatest sporting event of the last millennium?
Well, it depends on who you ask. It certainly would have been something that the fans back then would wanted to see. Most people, though, compare not the 31 Grays, although they were fantastic. Most historians talk about the 35 Pittsburgh Crawfords, which probably included some of the same players, because those are among the players who which Gus Greenlee rated to get and create the Crawfords team. The Crawfords team had 5 future Hall of Famers on it. I mentioned Oscar Charleston, Satchel Paige, Josh Gibson, Cool Papa Bell, and I can't remember who the 5th one is right now, but that team is often compared to the 27 Yankees and would have been quite a battle.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Doswell, for your time in this great presentation. And thank you to all of our attendees for joining us this evening. Just a reminder, the Office of Alumni Engagement is currently in the process of planning our future virtual events, and we do have some great ones lined up here in the next few weeks. On February 10th, you can join us for Predicting Consumer Behavior within a COVID environment with Professor Tom Prince. And then we'll also have an athletics town hall with our athletic director, Roger Haynes, from class of 82, and that will be on February 16th. You can view all of our events that we've got currently scheduled in the spring. You can also register for them on the Monmouth College website currently. As a reminder, as you leave the webinar today, you will be invited to fill out a quick 3-minute survey just to give us some feedback on types of events and speakers that you'd like to see at future engagements. Again, thank you so much, Dr. Doswell, for your time. We really appreciate it. Everyone, please have a great, safe, and wonderful week. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
That was fun. Thank you.
Absolutely.
All right.